what is an infectious disease? It's a illness, a disease caused by the transmission of a specific infectious agent or its toxic product from an infected person or animal, because some of the infections disease come from animal. It's not necessarily a human being. And it's transmitted to a susceptible host. And the transmission can be either direct or indirect transmission. There are a lot of ways to classify infectious diseases. One of the ways to look at it in terms of the clinical aspect, we have diarrheal diseases, respiratory diseases. We have disease of the central nervous system, cardiovascular infection, and we also have systemic infections when it is the blood that is infected. There is a microbiological classification as well. Infection can be caused by bacteria, virus. We have fungus or parasites, or sometimes the prion. Another way to look at it, and this is really important also for mathematical modeling, is to look at how the transmission is done. So it can be looked at whether in terms of contact, the contact can be direct, person to person, or indirect contact. We have a vector, mosquito, for example, transmitting malaria or dengue fever. Food and waterborne diseases, there are a lot of them, typhoid fever, airborne disease, measles, influenza, you can name it, and perinatal, from mother to child during delivery, for example. And other people look at the reservoir. The reservoir is the natural home of their infectious agents. So the reservoir can be human, for example, HIV, syphilis, gonorrhea. We have animal, and in that case, we talk about zoonosis. Soil, tetanus is one of these bacteria that we find in the soil. And water. And infections, or the dynamic of infectiousness, involve the infectious host. This is the person who is infected and is capable of transmitting the infection to other people. And we have a susceptible host, the one who's not yet infected but able to be infected if any contact with the pathogen is made. So the characteristics of each of the elements here will determine whether or not we have an infection or a transmission, and also how rapidly a transmission can be. So it will depend on the pathogen, what kind of pathogen it is, what kind of microbiologic processes is involved, the type of contact, is it direct, indirect contact? Those are very important elements to consider when it comes about looking at transmission of the diseases. Typically, for any infectious disease, we have a period where we are susceptible. We are not yet infected, so this is the susceptibility period. Once we get infected, there is a period that is called incubation period. This is the period where the bacteria or the pathogen, whatever it is, developing in the body. The characteristics here is that there is no symptoms. You look well, apparently. Then we have the start of symptoms, which is the symptomatic period, this period here, and a recovery or death, depending on the outcome. But when we look at transmission, the picture is just slightly different. In terms of transmission, we still have the susceptibility period. But then from the time of infection, we have one period that we call the latent period. The characteristic in this period is that the person is infected, but he is not able to transmit the infection to other people. And then you have the infectious period. Here, the person becomes able to transmit the infection. And that's why I've put an arrow here to show that there is ability to transmit the infection. And then the late stage is immune, death, or whatever outcome. It is also very important to note that the infectious period here, when we look at it in terms of the dynamic of infectious disease, the infectious period can start after the symptoms, or it can start before the symptoms here. This also means that the latent period can be longer than the incubation period, or the latent period can be shorter than the incubation period. And this has a very important implication when it comes to prevention of diseases. For example, in the case of SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, generally, people become infectious after the onset of symptoms. This means that if we isolate people or we implement a quarantine, it is more likely to be very effective because you become infectious after you have the symptoms. However, when it comes to influenza, for example, generally, people become infectious before the onset of symptoms. So by the time you diagnose influenza, a sizable proportion of people have been already transmitted with the disease. So the duration of the latent period, or when the infectious period starts relative to the symptoms of the onset of symptoms, is a very, very important element showing that can direct which kind of intervention is better for which kind of disease. Another important element to look at is the generation time and the serial interval. Both generation time and serial interval tell us about the time scale of disease transmission. What is it? I will explain in detail now. Transmission is between two persons, from one infected host to one susceptible host. When the transmission is done, we can estimate the time it takes from this person to transmit the infection to the susceptible host. And one of the ways is to look at the generation time, which is the time of infection from the first person to the time of infection for the second person. They call it generation time. And it's natural to understand that if the generation time is very short, it means that the disease will transmit very rapidly in a population because the interval time is shorter. But most of the time, we know that we have a disease only when we have symptoms. So it's really difficult to accurately estimate the time of infection because generally we don't know. So what we do is that we look at what we call the serial interval as a way to estimate the generation time. The serial interval is the lag time between the start of symptoms from the first infected person to the start of symptoms from the second infected person. And the same principle applies here. A shorter serial interval means that the disease will spread rapidly. A longer serial interval means that the disease is spreading slowly.